Hello, Bethlehem. We're going to be looking today in the book of Mark at several of the miracles that Jesus did at the end of chapter 4 and into chapter 5. We're actually going to deviate a little bit from the Gospel Project lesson book that we've typically been going by. Nothing wrong with the lesson they had today. It was actually very good. We're just going to look at a little broader scope and a little larger chunk of the book of Mark than what we would have studied in that gospel project lesson. And one of the reasons I want to do that is as I was trying to prepare for that lesson and started asking how does the passage that was in that lesson fit into the rest of the book of Mark, I saw something that I thought was pretty cool and thought it might be helpful to y'all to sort of see the thought process that sort of went behind that, and maybe even help your own Bible study some. So anyway, let's take a look at what we've got here. So the passage that we're going to be looking at is Mark chapter 4, verse 35, all the way to the end of chapter 5. So it's a really large chunk. And what we're going to look at in these miracle stories that are contained there is about Jesus's authority over all the things that we fear. And I want to show you where the original lesson was going to be and how we ended up at this larger lesson, because I think that may be helpful to you. And then we're going to sort of look at this larger chunk as a whole and how it fits within the book of Mark. So let's pull up the scripture passages and let you take a look at that. So the passage we would have originally been looking at in Mark chapter 5 would have been what's commonly called the healing of Jairus's daughter, and the raising of Jairus's daughter who dies in the middle of this story, and the healing of a woman who had a like a hemorrhage or was suffering from a bleeding for 12 years. So we would have originally started here and talked about the woman who was bleeding and how she comes and touched Jesus and he heals her, and he basically says, "Your faith has saved you. Go and be in peace." And then he continues on to Jairus' house, the synagogue leader's house, where his daughter is now dead, and Jesus comes and raises her from the dead. And so, as I was sort of prepping to get ready for this lesson, I usually look at a passage and say, well, how does it fit within the larger context, right? Right? No one reads a book. You would never pull a book off your shelf, a novel, and just open it up in the middle of the book and read a couple of paragraphs and think that you knew what that book was about. In fact, those paragraphs might not even make sense if you knew what the chapter until you knew what the chapter was about, and the chapter might not really make sense until you had read the rest of the book sometime. So anytime you're reading the Bible, it's always good to understand where this passage fits into the rest of the book, and then how that book even fits within the rest of the Bible. So, we were looking at this passage that was originally going to be what our lesson was about, the woman with the hemorrhage, the bleeding issue, and then Jairus' daughter, the synagogue leader's daughter, who dies. I just started flipping around in my Bible, to the pages that come after and the pages that come before, sort of saying, well, where's this story fit? And so obviously those two stories are miracle stories that are woven together. And then when you get to chapter 6, something definitely changes. He's packed up and he's moving on to an entirely different location, and he's naming his 12 apostles, and John the Baptist get beheaded. And so it kind of feels like the stories that come after that are a little bit disconnected from the stories of Jairus' daughter and the woman with the issue of blood. So if you back up and look ahead of those stories, what you run into is, first of all, another miracle story where Jesus drives out demons out of a man who was possessed by quite a number of demons. And then, ahead of that one, another miracle story where Jesus commands the winds and the waves to cease, to be still, and he calms this terrible storm that they're stuck in. So there's another miracle story. So basically, you got 4 miracle stories there. You do have the raising of Jairus' daughter. You do have the woman who's healed from the bleeding issue. You have the casting the demons out of the man, and then you have Jesus calming the wind and the waves in this terrible storm. So you got these cluster of stories, And then as you keep looking back, suddenly it changes to parables, more parables, more parables, parables, more parables, more parables. And so you just have a long section of parables ahead of it and so all those parables sort of fit together. And then you have these miracle stories that sort of fit together. So the question is, okay, so if we're looking at this story about Jairus's daughter and Jesus raising her, and this woman with this blood bleeding issue who Jesus heals, and those stories are part of a block of other miracle stories. The question becomes, how does that block of miracle stories work? What is it that Mark's doing by collecting all of those into that spot? What's he trying to teach us about Jesus? How does it fit into the story within Mark, the larger story within Mark? Because Mark's gospel is really short. It's only 16 chapters, and it's really fast paced. So it's very obvious that Mark has carefully picked what stories he puts into his book, right? Because Jesus did an awful lot of things in his 3-year ministry, way more than what Mark gets into these short 16 chapters. So you have to start asking the question, why does he pick these stories, and why does he arrange them the way that they do? So that's something that we're going to look at. So we're going to look at a long passage. We're going to read through the whole thing, which we'll try to do it kind of quickly, and then just sort of take a bird's eye view of how all of those stories fit together and what they teach us about Jesus. So before we look at the fairly long passage, let's remind ourselves of a couple of things about the book of Mark. Okay, so if you read through the whole book of Mark, again, it's very fast paced, doesn't take long. You could sit down and probably read the whole thing within an hour. Couple of key verses where Mark sort of lets us know what's going on, and the first one is the very first verse. So Mark chapter 1, verse 1, sort of, he just jumps right into what he's doing. And it's a short verse. It says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so there's a couple of key words there. One is gospel, right? This is a good news, right? This is a good news story. There is something that is good for us to know about this, because that's what gospel means. And it's the gospel of Jesus, who is the Christ. And so right from the very first verse, John tells us that Jesus is the Christ, or the Messiah, which means the anointed one. Or in other words, he's the one who's been chosen to lead or chosen to rule. He's the promised king that Israel had been waiting for, the promised prophet that Israel had been waiting for, the one who was going to make things right again. And Mark also goes ahead and says this good news about this promised king. He's not just the promised king, he is divine, he is the Son of God. So right there in the first verse, we see that this Jesus is going to have some massive kind of authority that only the Son of God would have. And then later in the book of Mark, as Jesus, in chapter 10, when Jesus gets into a discussion with some of his disciples about authority and the authority that they really wanted to have, he sort of sets them straight about what kind of king and how he is going to be and how he's going to use his authority. And so another really key verse in the Gospel of Mark is Mark 10:45, where Jesus basically lays out, here's his purpose in coming. He says, for even the Son of Man, he gives a different title to himself, right? And Mark in the first verse gives him the title the Son of God. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man because he is divine, but he's also human. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus knows that his life is meant to be a life of service. He's come to do good to us, for us, to do for us what we could not do for ourselves. And he's come ultimately to give his life as a payment, as a ransom for us, that we can be made right with God, that our sins can be forgiven, that we can be restored to a relationship with God and with each other in a way that we can then go out and serve also. So that title, the Son of Man, also carries with it the idea of authority, right? And that comes from Daniel chapter 7. I'm not going to pull it up on the screen, but I'm just going to read this to you. And so way back in the Old Testament, Daniel is having this vision. He's seeing God on his throne. And as he's seeing God on his throne, he says, I continued watching in the night visions, and suddenly one like a son of man, right? That's Jesus' favorite name for himself. One like a son of man was coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days. This son of man approaches God and was escorted before him. And he, the Son of Man, was given dominion and glory and a kingdom so that those of every people, nation, and language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. And so the thing that you see in these two key verses in Mark is that Jesus has, or that Mark is telling us that Jesus has this authority as the Son of God and as the Son of Man to rule over all of us. And then Mark is communicating to us what Jesus says about how he is going to use his authority and what kind of king and ruler he's going to be. He's going to be one who did not come to serve, but to not come to be served, but he came to serve us and to give his life as a ransom for many. So with that sort of stage set, there's a kind of authority that Jesus has, but the way that he intends to use that authority is not the way that we often look at politicians and kings and see them using their authority for their own benefit, their own greed. We finally see in Jesus the type of love and power that God has funneled on our behalf. And so we're going to look at these miracle stories, and what we're going to find is that Mark is using these 4 miracle stories to teach us something about how expansive Jesus' authority is and how good it is for us and how it can help us to trust in him and not to be afraid of anything that would happen. So let's take a look at this long passage. We'll run through it kind of quick, and then we'll just talk about what it means. And so let's pick up at Mark chapter 4, verse 35. And it's the first miracle story. Right? And on that day, when evening had come, he told them, let's walk over to the other side of the sea. And so they left the crowd and took him along since he was in the boat. And the other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking over the boat. So we've got a great windstorm, we've got waves. Waves are breaking over the boat. And so that the boat was already being swamped. He was in the stern, sleeping on the cushion. So they woke him up and said to him, Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die? He got up, he rebuked the wind, and he said to the sea, Silence, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And then he said to them, Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? And they were terrified and asked one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? So a couple things just real quick in this one is we keep getting this thing about the wind, waves, and the sea. So we've got the windstorm comes, waves are breaking over the boat. He rebukes the wind. He says to the sea, the wind ceased. It's a great calm. And they're amazed that even the wind and the sea obey him. So there's this almost contest between Jesus and the forces of nature there. And Jesus shows his authority over the forces of nature so that when he's done, the disciples are terrified and amazed and are asking one another, who is this? What kind of man is this that he could speak to the wind and the sea? These things that to us feel like chaos. They're just something you cannot control. You cannot control a tornado. You cannot control a thunderstorm. You cannot control the waves in the ocean. And for someone to just speak and then they obey him has them terrified at the amount of power that's in the boat with them. And they're trying to figure out what kind of man is this, because remember, at this point, they don't know fully what Mark has already told us in the first verse, that this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. I don't think they fully understand all of that yet. So as we go on to the second story, the demons driven out by Jesus. So then they came to the other side of the sea, to the region of the Gerasenes. And as soon as he, Jesus, got out of the boat, a man with an unclean spirit came out of the tombs and met him. And he lived in the tombs, and no one was able to restrain him anymore, not even with a chain, because he often had been bound with shackles and chains, but had torn the chains apart and smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. So you have the story of this guy who is possessed by these evil spirits, has an enormous amount of strength because of that. People are obviously afraid of him. They've tried to chain him out, in the caves, among the tombs. They got him out chained up in a cemetery, but he keeps breaking loose. And when Jesus saw from a distance, he ran and knelt down before him, and he cried out with a loud voice. The demons call out, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" So they know who he is. "I beg you before God, don't torment me." For he had told him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." "What is your name?" Jesus asked him. "My name is Legion," which was, a group of Roman soldiers. Right? He answered him, "Because we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the region. And so basically what happens is they ask for permission to be sent into this herd of pigs. Jesus sends them into the herd of pigs. They run off a steep bank and they drown there. And the men who see this happen, who are in that area, they're terrified, right? Much like the disciples were terrified at seeing the amount of power that Jesus had when he spoke to the winds and the storm. These guys are now terrified because they've seen Jesus speak a word and pull the demons out of this man, where they've been trying to chain him up among the tombs, been unsuccessful. Verse 18, as Jesus was getting in the boat, the man who had been demon possessed begged him earnestly that he might remain with him. Jesus did not let him, but told him, "Go home to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." Jesus' power is there in releasing this man from the power of evil, of these demons. And so he says, the Lord has done much for you. The Lord has had mercy on you. Jesus' authority was used in the first story to protect his disciples. In the second story, to have mercy on this man, to set him free from this evil oppression that he's under. And Jesus gets back in the boat and he crosses over. But when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the sea. One of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. So for a synagogue leader to fall at Jesus' feet means he obviously had a great deal of respect for Jesus, had heard about Jesus and the power that he had. And he begs him earnestly, "My little daughter is dying. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may get well and live." And Jesus, with compassion, went with him, and a large crowd was following and pressing against him. While they're on the way, right, verse 25, now a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under many doctors. She had spent everything she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. Having heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothing. For she said, "If I just touch his clothes, I'll be made well." Instantly, her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Let's stop right there and just talk some about this lady suffering from bleeding for 12 years. That's a long time. 12 years is a long time to suffer from anything, but she spent all of her money trying to be healed of this. Nothing has helped at all. Instead, it's just gotten worse. And one of the things to understand is, if a woman was suffering from this type of bleeding, then she would, again, much like some of the lepers and other things in other classes, would have been considered unclean, right? She would not have been able to go, to the women's court at the temple. She would not have been able to participate in a lot of other activities. If she touched someone else, then they become unclean. So there's this sense that this lady is going to have issues with socializing, with being around people. She's probably very lonely, and her health has really been a problem to her. So she's been isolated because of this uncleanness that she has. Can't really be around other people a whole lot, and she's spent everything that she's got to try to get well. And it says in verse 30, immediately Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he was looking around to see who had done this. And the woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And Jesus only uses this word once or twice ever in the Gospels, daughter. He calls her daughter. He said to her, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction. So here you see Jesus' compassion healing this woman who has this issue of blood. She's been, socially isolated because of the ceremonial uncleanness that it causes, plus the physical suffering from it and the financial suffering that's come from that. And so Jesus heals her. He honors her faith. He heals her. He sends her off in peace. Of course, the thing to remember is the whole time that this story is going on, the whole time this little event is going on, poor Jairus over here is just standing there waiting on Jesus to get moving again. He's probably a little bit upset at this woman who showed up and sort of distracted Jesus from the important task of getting to his daughter who is sick. So as we keep rolling, we find out that things have gotten worse. So while he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house and said, your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? When Jesus overheard what was said, he told the synagogue leader, don't be afraid, only believe. He did not let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, and John, James's brother. And they came to the leader's house, and he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So they already had these mourners who had shown up to weep for this poor girl who had died. And Jesus went in and said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep. They laughed at him. But he put them all outside. He took the child's father, mother, and those who were with him, and entered the place where the child was. And then he took the child by the hand and said to her, Aramaic, Talitha kum, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years old, and this they were utterly astounded. Of course, Jesus, out of care for her, tells them, get her something to eat. Kind of funny. He gives them strict orders that no one should know about this, right? Because he doesn't want people to misunderstand what kind of king he is going to be, as they recognize that he is the Messiah. But Mark is going to use these series of stories to show us what kind of king Jesus is for us. So we've got these 4 miracle stories. Jesus' power over the storm, Jesus' power over the demons and the forces of evil, Jesus' power over the woman's sickness, and Jesus' power over the death of Jairus' daughter. So let's take a look at that. So remember our 2 key verses in the book of Mark. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, right? That shows us that Jesus is the promised king, and he is one with authority, right? The authority that God has, a kind of authority that rules over all of the nations with a kingdom that doesn't end, but that may not look exactly like what we expect, right? He's one with an authority where he didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean? What is Mark trying to tell us with those collection of 4 miracle stories? So we've got these 4 miracles, right? You got the calming of the storm, the driving out of the demons, the healing of a woman suffering from bleeding, the raising of Jairus' daughter, all collected in a collection. They come behind a section of parables before, some other narrative that aren't miracle stories, but we have these 4 miracle stories collected here. And if you stop and think about the things that make us afraid, this is sort of what struck me when I went back and started looking at these 4 miracle stories. What are the things that we're oftentimes afraid of? We're oftentimes afraid of the forces of nature. So things like hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes and fire and droughts and floods and things that we can't control. We've gotten to the point with science that we can sort of maybe predict when these things happen, but we can't stop them. We can't steer them. We can't. We barely can get out of their way, and we're not even that good at predicting them, really. And so when you think about the forces of nature and the power that that has over us, if it just decides to stop raining, there's not a thing in the world that we can do about it. If it decides to come up a tornado, there's not a thing in the world that we can do to stop it. I mean, it can pick our house up and toss it to the other side of the county like it's a pack of matches. And the other thing that we're afraid of is we're afraid of evil. We're afraid of evil people. We're afraid of people breaking into our homes. We're afraid of the spiritual forces of evil. We read in the Bible about demons and the devils, and sometimes we're afraid of our own selves and the temptations that we give into, and we just see the destruction that is there from evil. Right? You look around at the hatred that comes from that, and you look around at the destruction that comes from evil. Uh, and sometimes we blame other people for that, but the Bible reminds us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but it's against powers and principalities. And so, in other words, it's against the spiritual forces of evil that influence us in the wrong way against God in this world, and we're afraid of that. And again, we can't control what other people do, and so it's frightening. So sometimes we just don't know what to do about that, and we're afraid of sickness. We're afraid of getting sick. We're afraid of watching our relatives get sick and watching them decline, and then the isolation that causes. Right? You think about the pandemic right now, and the folks who especially some of the folks who are older and they can't get out, they can't go anywhere, they're not, or at least they're not supposed to, and the feeling of isolation that can come with that. And this thing is dragging on and on and on. And hearing this, we've got this story here about this woman who suffers for 12 years. You think sometimes about people with different kinds of cancer or heart disease who just suffer for such a long period of time, and we're afraid of that. And if we're honest about it, we're afraid of death. And as Christians, we don't have to be afraid of death because we have this hope. But death is the enemy. The Bible always sort of communicates death as something that is our enemy. It's an enemy to be destroyed. We weren't meant to die like we do. We weren't designed and built to die the way that we do. Death comes as a result of sin in the world, and we don't know. We read what's in the Bible, but we don't know what it's like on the other side. So sometimes we fear our own death. Those without Jesus fear death, and because they just don't know what's on the other side of it. You don't get a practice running at that. But what we see in these four stories, these things that are the things that we are all afraid of in some way or other, the forces of nature, the forces of evil, sickness, isolation, death, is what we see is that Jesus's absolute authority exists over these things. That in all of these situations, with a word or with a touch, he ends these things, right? With a word, he ends the storm. With a word, he drives the demons out of this man. With a touch, he removes the sickness and the uncleanness and the isolation from this woman, which, by the way, Jesus was not supposed to touch her. Right? She touches him, which technically should have made him unclean. But again, he's Jesus, right? He's the Son of God. He's the Christ. And so what should have made him unclean, again, makes her clean. And to touch a dead person, again, was something that would have made him ceremonially unclean, but he does it anyway. He takes her by the hand, Jairus' daughter, and he speaks to her and says, "Little girl, get up." And she does. And so all of these teach us that Jesus has absolute authority over all of the things that make us afraid. The forces of evil, other people and the forces of evil, isolation, sickness, nature, and even death. And Jesus' raising of Jairus' daughter, right? This is the first time in the Gospels that he raises someone from the dead. And if I'm not mistaken, there are only 3 times, maybe 4. I have to go back and count, that he raises someone from the dead. But those are all pointers to his resurrection. And of course, the difference between Jesus' resurrection and all of these others is that when Jesus rises from the dead, he rises to die no more. Jairus' daughter died again one day. Lazarus died again one day. But Jesus rose as a true resurrection. That's why it's called the first fruits of the resurrection, to give us hope. And you see that all of these things point to the kind of ruler, the kind of king that Jesus is for us. He is the king who has absolute authority over nature, evil, sickness, and death, and he exercises that authority for the good of the people, right? To protect his disciples, to cast the demons out of this Gentile guy who we don't even know his name, to heal this older woman who has been sick for 12 years, to raise a 12-year-old girl from the dead. And so, what does that mean for us? So the application of this is understanding and knowing that we can know that Jesus is sovereign over all that we could fear, that there's nothing that we could be afraid of that is out of his control. There's nothing that could come into our life that he is not in complete control over. The other thing that we get is that when we read the Gospels, when we read Mark, when we read Luke, when we read John, what we find is that they teach us that Jesus is both good and wise. So he's not only sovereign. He could be all powerful but not be good, or he could be all good but not be powerful. Neither of which really gets us anywhere. But he is sovereign over all things, over all that we could fear. But he's also good and wise. We can trust him. So we know that he can rescue us when we need rescue, or he can sustain us in the middle of things, in the middle of sickness, in the middle of death. Not everyone gets healed. Not everyone gets saved from death. Not everyone makes it through the storm. But in those things, we can trust that if God has allowed us to go through those things, continues to place us in those, that there is a purpose for it, because he could remove us from it. But because he is good and wise, if we continue to go through those things, if we stay sick, then there is a purpose in those things, and that Jesus is sovereign over that purpose. And because he is good and wise, he can sustain us, he can give us endurance, he can grow our faith in the midst of those things. We can trust that whatever happens to us for our good. All things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to his purpose, right? Romans 8:28. So these miracle stories all point to the type of king that Jesus is for us. He is sovereign and he is able. He is good and wise and compassionate. In the middle of this rush, he stops to talk to this woman in the crowd. In the middle of his trip, he stops to take time, instead of just leaving the guy in the wilderness alone with the demons like everyone else and trying to just get rid of him. Jesus engages with him, passionate. He's come to serve. He's not come to be a despot, to be a dictator, but he's come to serve. And as his children, as he came and gave his life as a ransom for us, to redeem us from our sins, to give us a new life, then he calls us to serve others in the same kind of way. Right? And we see that death is not the end. And he lives now, even now, to intercede for us. And so we can rejoice that this is the kind of God that we have, and this is the kind of Savior that Jesus is for us. And so that's what Mark is trying to teach us with these 4 miracle stories that are packaged together here at the front end of his gospel, is what kind of Son of God is he? What kind of Christ is he? What kind of King of the universe is Jesus going to be? He is one with absolute authority, but also absolute goodness, who has come to serve and to give his life as a ransom for us. And so my prayer for you this week, as you go out into a world that is not always as we would want it to be, that we know that Christ is with us, and that we should go out and without fear look for ways that we can serve others to make this world better than we found it, trusting that Jesus is with us as we do that. He can give his life for us, and we can give our life in service to others. So thank you. Hope you all have a great week.